I never thought I'd question my faith. Growing up in a devout Muslim household in suburban Detroit, religion wasn't just part of our lives. It was the foundation upon which everything else was built. My father, a respected imam at our local mosque, had raised me with unwavering conviction in our beliefs. My mother, though quieter in her devotion, demonstrated her faith through daily acts of kindness and prayer. I followed their example, finding comfort in the ritual and certainty of our traditions. Until that night in Chicago changed everything. The day had started like any other business trip. I'd flown in early morning for a series of meetings with potential investors for our tech startup. The presentations had gone well, and I remember feeling particularly satisfied as I headed back to my hotel in my rental car. The streets were quiet, with only the occasional vehicle passing through the intersection. The green light ahead gave me confidence to proceed, and I remember thinking about calling my wife to share the good news about the meetings. That's when time seemed to slow down. Through my peripheral vision, I caught the massive grille of an 18-wheeler barreling toward my passenger side. The driver's face was illuminated by his phone screen, his eyes nowhere near the road. I had just enough time to register the horror of what was about to happen before the impact came. The sound was deafening, a symphony of crushing metal and shattering glass. My car spun violently, the world becoming a blur of street lights and shadows. Then came the stillness. Not the stillness of peace, but the absolute silence that follows chaos. I felt disconnected from my body, as if I were floating above the scene. Below me, I could see my crumpled car, emergency lights already flashing in the distance. But what caught my attention was something else entirely. A pull, gentle but insistent, drawing me toward what appeared to be a tunnel of darkness. The tunnel wasn't like anything I'd read about in near-death experience accounts. There was no warm, welcoming light, no deceased relatives waiting with open arms. Instead, the darkness seemed to have texture, like velvet shadows that brushed against my consciousness as I moved through them. The air, if you could call it that, felt heavy with meaning, as if every molecule carried whispered secrets from beyond. As I ventured deeper, I began to discern shapes in the darkness. They weren't physical forms as we know them, but rather impressions of reality, like watching shadows play on a cave wall. And then I saw him. The figure was unmistakable. The noble bearing, the distinctive features I'd seen depicted in countless historical descriptions. My heart seemed to stop, though I wasn't sure it had been beating in this state anyway. There, in this realm of shadows and whispers, stood the Prophet Muhammad. But something was wrong. The Prophet's presence, which I had always imagined would be surrounded by divine light and peace, was instead enveloped in a darkness that seemed to pulse with regret. His eyes, when they met mine, carried a weight of sorrow that shattered every preconception I'd ever held. This wasn't the triumphant messenger of God I'd been taught about since childhood. This was something else entirely. A figure grappling with the consequences of human interpretation and misunderstanding. I tried to move closer, driven by an overwhelming need to understand, to ask questions that had never before formed in my mind. But an invisible barrier held me back, like trying to walk against a powerful wind. The Prophet's lips moved, but the words that reached me seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Not everything you believe is as you were taught. The message hit me with the force of another collision. In that moment, everything I had built my life upon seemed to shift like sand beneath my feet. The certainty I had cherished, the unwavering faith that had defined my identity, all of it began to crumble in the face of this revelation. Before I could process more, the scene began to fade. The tunnel started to collapse in on itself, and I felt a violent pulling sensation, as if my consciousness was being yanked back through layers of reality. The last thing I saw was the Prophet's eyes, filled with a compassion that seemed to transcend any religious doctrine or human understanding. Then came the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room, the beeping of monitors, and the worried faces of my family. I'd been unconscious for 3 days, they told me. The doctors spoke of miracle recoveries and statistical improbabilities, but their words felt distant and unimportant. All I could think about was what I had witnessed in that space between life and death, and how it would change everything I thought I knew about faith, truth, and the nature of belief itself. My wife, Sarah, sat beside my bed, her hand gripping mine with the strength of someone afraid to let go. She had dark circles under her eyes, testament to sleepless nights spent in hospital chairs. But it was the look in her eyes that truly caught my attention, a mix of relief and concern, as if she could sense that the man who had gone into that crash wasn't quite the same one who had come out of it. As I lay there, surrounded by the trappings of modern medicine and the love of my family, I knew I was standing at a crossroads. The experience had planted a seed of doubt that would grow into something I couldn't ignore. The journey ahead would challenge everything I believed, strain relationships I treasured, and ultimately lead me down a path I never expected to travel. But in that moment, watching the sunrise through my hospital window, I knew there was no going back. The search for truth had begun, and it would transform my life in ways I could never have imagined. The hospital became my sanctuary of contemplation during those first few weeks of recovery. Physical therapy occupied my mornings, but it was the afternoons and long, sleepless nights that became devoted to wrestling with what I had experienced. The memory of the prophet in that dark place haunted me, not with fear, but with an insistence that demanded attention. Each time I closed my eyes, I could see the sorrow in his expression, feel the weight of unspoken truths in his presence. My father visited daily, bringing with him the comforting scent of incense from the mosque and well wishes from our community. He would sit beside my bed, reciting verses from the Quran in his melodious voice, a sound that had always brought me peace. But now, each verse seemed to carry new questions, hidden meanings I had never considered before. I found myself studying his face as he read, wondering if he had ever experienced moments of doubt in his own spiritual journey. "You seem troubled, my son," he said one evening, closing the holy book with careful reverence. "Is it the pain?" I couldn't bring myself to share the truth with him yet. How could I explain that the foundations of faith he had so carefully built in me were shaking? Instead, I smiled weakly and blamed my restlessness on the discomfort of healing bones. But his eyes, so like mine, held mine for a long moment, and I knew he sensed something deeper stirring beneath the surface. Sarah, ever perceptive, noticed the change in me as well. She would bring books from the library, not just Islamic texts, but works on near-death experiences, comparative religion, and spiritual philosophy. "You need something to occupy your mind while you heal," she'd say, but I caught the worried glances she cast my way when she thought I wasn't looking. Our evening conversations, once filled with comfortable discussions about work and family, now often trailed into silence as I struggled to articulate the transformation happening within me. One night, about a month after the accident, I finally shared my experience with her. We sat in the small garden behind our house, the summer air heavy with the scent of blooming jasmine. Sarah listened without interruption as I described the tunnel, the shadows, and the profound sadness I had witnessed in the prophet's presence. When I finished, she was quiet for so long, I feared I had destroyed something precious between us. "I don't understand completely," she finally said, her voice soft but steady, "but I understand enough to know this matters deeply to you. Whatever path this leads you down, I'm here." Her acceptance brought tears to my eyes, but it also gave me the courage to begin my search for answers in earnest. I reached out to scholars, both traditional and progressive, seeking perspectives on my experience. Some dismissed it as a trauma-induced hallucination, others as a test of faith to be overcome. But a few, a precious few, listened with open minds and shared their own stories of spiritual awakening and evolution. Dr. Amina Rahman, a religious studies professor at the local university, became an unexpected ally in my quest for understanding. Her office, cluttered with books in multiple languages and artifacts from various religious traditions, became a weekly refuge where I could speak freely about my doubts and questions. "The mystery of faith," she told me during one of our discussions, "is not in its certainties, but in its questions. Throughout history, the greatest spiritual leaders have all been seekers first. They questioned, they doubted, they struggled, just as you are doing now." Her words gave me permission to explore beyond the boundaries of my traditional understanding. I began attending interfaith discussions, meditation groups, and even a weekly gathering of people who had experienced near-death phenomena. Each conversation, each new perspective, added another piece to the puzzle I was trying to solve. But this exploration came at a cost. Word of my spiritual wandering began to spread through our close-knit Muslim community. Friends who had known me since childhood began to distance themselves, their greetings becoming formal and strained. My father, though he never spoke against me directly, carried a new sadness in his eyes whenever we met. The turning point came during a Friday prayer service. I continued attending, more out of respect for my family than personal conviction. As I stood among the faithful, going through the familiar motions of prayer, the imam began speaking about the dangers of straying from the true path. Though he mentioned no names, his eyes found mine in the congregation, and I felt the weight of dozens of stares following his gaze. That evening, I sat alone in my study, surrounded by the books and journals that had become my companions in this journey. The call to prayer echoed from the nearby mosque, its familiar cadence stirring memories of simpler times. But as I listened, I realized something profound. The truth I was seeking couldn't be found in either complete rejection or blind acceptance of my old beliefs. It lay somewhere in the space between, in the courage to hold both doubt and faith in the same heart. I began writing that night, pouring out my experience and thoughts into what would eventually become a memoir. The words flowed easily, as if they had been waiting for this moment to emerge. I wrote about the accident, the vision, and the journey that followed. But more importantly, I wrote about the universal human experience of questioning, seeking, and growing beyond the boundaries of inherited belief. The manuscript became my constant companion, growing alongside my understanding. Each chapter reflected not just my personal journey, but the larger questions facing many in our modern world. How do we honor our religious heritage while remaining true to our evolving spiritual understanding? How do we build bridges between traditional faith and personal truth? As autumn approached, bringing with it the golden light that made our neighborhood mosque glow like amber, I received an unexpected visit from my father. He found me in the garden, working on another chapter of my book. Without speaking, he sat beside me on the weathered bench, his prayer beads clicking softly in his hands. "Your mother and I have been talking," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of careful consideration. "We may not understand the path you're on, but we remember something my father once told me. The heart that seeks God with sincerity cannot be lost, even if it wanders far from home." His words opened a door I had thought forever closed. That evening, as we shared tea and memories, I realized that true spiritual growth doesn't require abandoning our roots. It means allowing them to grow deeper while our branches reach toward new light. The conversation with my father marked a subtle but significant shift in my journey. As winter descended upon Detroit, bringing with it short days and long nights perfect for reflection, I found myself drawn to explore the intersection between traditional faith and personal truth. The manuscript of my book had grown substantially, but more importantly, it had evolved from a simple account of my near-death experience into a deeper exploration of spiritual transformation. I began hosting small gatherings in my home, initially just a handful of people who had reached out after hearing about my experience. Sarah, who had always possessed a gift for making people feel welcome, would prepare Middle Eastern dishes that filled our house with the comforting aromas of cardamom and saffron. Around our dining table, over steaming cups of mint tea, people shared their own stories of spiritual questioning and transformation. There was Michael, a former evangelical pastor who had experienced a similar vision during a heart attack. Rebecca, a Jewish anthropologist whose studies of ancient mystical traditions had led her to question her own religious assumptions. And Khalid, a young medical student from our mosque, who confessed to harboring doubts similar to my own, but had never found a safe space to express them. These gatherings grew organically, through word of mouth and quiet recommendations. We didn't advertise or promote them. They simply became known as a place where honest spiritual discussion could happen without judgment. Sometimes we would sit in silence, meditation punctuated only by the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Other times, conversations would stretch late into the night, exploring questions that had no easy answers but demanded to be asked. One evening, as snow fell softly outside our windows, a young woman named Aisha shared her story. She had grown up in a conservative Muslim family in Pakistan, moved to America for graduate studies, and found herself struggling with the contrast between her traditional upbringing and her evolving spiritual understanding. When I heard about your experience, she told me, her voice quiet but steady, it was the first time I felt that maybe I wasn't alone in my questions. Maybe it was possible to honor where I came from while still being true to where my heart was leading me. Her words resonated deeply with the others present, sparking a discussion that would ultimately lead to the formation of what we came to call the Bridges of Understanding initiative. The idea was simple but profound. Create spaces where people from different religious backgrounds could explore their spiritual questions together, supporting each other while respecting their diverse traditions. The initiative began small. Just our living room gatherings expanded to include more structured discussions and occasional workshops. We invited scholars, spiritual teachers, and ordinary people with extraordinary stories to share their perspectives. Dr. Rahman from the university became a regular participant, bringing her academic insight while remaining open to the more personal, experiential aspects of our exploration. My father, to my surprise and deep gratitude, began attending some of these gatherings. Though he rarely spoke, his presence carried significant meaning. Other religious leaders from our community, initially skeptical, gradually began to show interest. Not all approved, of course. Some continued to view our activities with suspicion or outright hostility. But the conversation had begun, and it was spreading in ways I hadn't anticipated. The manuscript of my book evolved alongside these developments. What had started as a personal account expanded to include the stories of others who had experienced similar spiritual awakenings. Each chapter became a bridge between different ways of understanding faith and truth. I wrote about the prophet I had seen in my vision, but now I could place that experience in a broader context of spiritual transformation across cultures and traditions. Sarah's role in all of this cannot be overstated. She became not just a supportive spouse, but an active partner in creating these spaces for dialogue and understanding. Her background in counseling proved invaluable as our community grew and the emotional complexity of our work deepened. She helped develop guidelines for our discussions that ensured everyone felt safe sharing their experiences while maintaining respect for all religious traditions. One particularly memorable evening, as spring began to soften winter's edge, we hosted a gathering that brought together members of 5 different faith traditions. The discussion centered on the nature of divine revelation and personal spiritual experience. As I listened to the various perspectives being shared, I was struck by how far we had come from those first confused days after my accident. A young rabbi in attendance made an observation that captured something essential about our work. Perhaps the most profound spiritual truth, he said, is that we're all climbing the same mountain by different paths. The view from each path is unique and valuable, but the summit we seek is the same. The impact of our initiative began to spread beyond our immediate community. Other cities reached out, asking for guidance and starting similar dialogue groups. I found myself traveling more frequently, speaking at universities and religious centers about the importance of creating space for spiritual questioning and growth. My book, when it was finally published, received a mixed reception, exactly as I had expected. Some religious conservatives condemned it as dangerous relativism, while others praised its honest exploration of faith in the modern world. But the responses that meant the most came from individuals who found in its pages the courage to face their own spiritual questions. One letter from a young man in Toronto particularly moved me. Your story helped me understand that questioning one's faith isn't a sign of weakness, but can be a path to deeper understanding. I've spent years feeling guilty about my doubts. Now I see them as invitations to grow. As our community continued to evolve, I often reflected on that moment in the tunnel when I saw the prophet surrounded by shadows. What had seemed at first like a crisis of faith had become something far more meaningful, an invitation to expand my understanding of spiritual truth and help others do the same. Sarah found me one evening in my study, staring at the framed photograph of our first gathering. "You're thinking about that night again, aren't you?" she asked, knowing she didn't need to specify which night she meant. "I am," I admitted, "but differently now. I used to think that experience was about losing my faith. Now I understand it was about finding a larger truth." She smiled, taking my hand, "And helping others find theirs." Outside, the call to prayer echoed from the mosque, its familiar cadence mixing with the evening sounds of our neighborhood. In my heart, I felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the journey I had been given, but for all those who had chosen to walk beside me on this path of understanding. The success of Bridges of Understanding brought with it new challenges and opportunities. As our 5th year of community gatherings approached, we found ourselves at a crossroads. What had begun in our living room had grown into a movement that touched lives across continents. Emails arrived daily from people seeking guidance, sharing their stories, or asking how they could start similar initiatives in their communities. One morning, as I sat in my study reviewing these messages, I received an unexpected call from Dr. Yassin Al-Qadi, a prominent religious scholar from Al-Azhar University in Cairo. He had read my book and, rather than condemning it as I might have expected, expressed a deep interest in our work. "What you describe," he said, his voice crackling slightly over the international connection, "mirrors ancient discussions within Islamic mysticism about the nature of religious experience and divine truth. Perhaps it's time these conversations reached a broader audience." His interest led to an invitation to speak at an international conference on religious dialogue in Cairo. The significance wasn't lost on me. Al-Azhar University represented traditional Islamic scholarship at its most prestigious. That they would consider giving a platform to someone whose experience challenged conventional interpretations marked a significant shift in religious discourse. Sarah insisted on accompanying me to Cairo, understanding the emotional weight of returning to a center of Islamic learning with my transformed perspective. As our plane descended over the city, the ancient minarets piercing the morning haze, I felt a mixture of anxiety and anticipation that reminded me of those first days after my near-death experience. The conference itself proved transformative in ways I hadn't anticipated. My presentation, scheduled for the second day, drew an unexpectedly large audience. As I shared my story and the work that had grown from it, I noticed something remarkable in the faces before me. Not the skepticism or hostility I had feared, but a deep, resonant recognition. During the question and answer session, a young scholar from Indonesia stood up. "Your experience," she said, "gives voice to questions many of us carry in silence. How do we remain true to our traditions while acknowledging that spiritual truth might be larger than any single interpretation?" Her question sparked a discussion that continued well beyond the allocated time, spilling into the hallways and courtyards of the ancient university. Scholars from different schools of thought engaged in passionate but respectful debate about the nature of religious experience and the possibility of multiple paths to divine truth. Dr. Al-Qadi later told me, "What you've started isn't new. It's a continuation of discussions that have existed within our traditions for centuries. But perhaps now is the time these conversations need to reach beyond academic circles." The conference led to unexpected collaborations. A group of scholars from various institutions proposed creating an international network for spiritual dialogue, using our Bridges of Understanding model as a framework. We spent late nights in Cairo's cafes, surrounded by the scent of shisha and the sound of distant prayers, drafting plans for this expanded initiative. Upon returning home, we found our local community had grown in our absence. The weekly gatherings now regularly drew people from across the state, and we had to move them to a larger venue, a converted warehouse that one of our members, a successful businessman named David, had offered to renovate for our use. The new space allowed us to expand our activities. Besides the regular dialogue sessions, we began offering workshops on meditation, comparative religious studies, and practical spiritual practices from various traditions. A library took shape in one corner, filled with donated books spanning religious and spiritual traditions from around the world. One particularly meaningful development was the youth program, spearheaded by Aisha, who had grown from a hesitant participant to a confident leader within our community. She created a space where young people could explore their spiritual questions without fear of judgment or pressure to conform to any particular belief system. The questions these young people are asking, she told me one evening after a particularly intense session, are the same ones we all carry. They just haven't learned to hide them yet. The program proved especially valuable for children from interfaith families, who often struggled to reconcile different religious traditions. We watched as they found ways to honor both their parents' faiths while developing their own authentic spiritual understanding. My father, who had continued to attend our gatherings with increasing regularity, surprised me one evening by asking to address the youth group. He spoke with remarkable candor about his own journey of understanding, sharing how his initial resistance to my changed perspective had led him to deeper reflection on his own faith. Truth, he told them, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom, is like light shining through a stained glass window. The light is one, but it appears in many colors. Each color is beautiful and true, but none contains the whole truth alone. His words became something of a touchstone for our community, often quoted in discussions and featured prominently on the wall of our news center. More importantly, they represented a bridge between traditional faith and evolving spiritual understanding that many found helpful in their own journeys. Sarah's role in our work continued to deepen. She developed a program specifically for families navigating religious differences, drawing on her counseling background and our community's collective experience. The program became so successful that other interfaith organizations began sending people to study our approach. One evening, as we sat in our garden watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of purple and gold, Sarah asked me a question that made me pause. Do you ever wonder if this is what you were meant to see in that tunnel? Not just the prophet in shadow, but the possibility of bringing light to other shadows. Her question stayed with me, leading to a new chapter in my book's latest edition. In it, I explored how personal spiritual crisis could become a catalyst for community transformation. The chapter included stories from our members, showing how individual journeys of questioning and discovery had contributed to a larger tapestry of understanding. As our work continued to expand, we faced new challenges. Some religious conservatives intensified their criticism, seeing our success as a threat to traditional authority. We received occasional hostile messages, and some local religious leaders warned their congregations against participating in our programs. Yet for every voice raised in opposition, there seemed to be many more seeking what we offered. We began receiving invitations to share our model with communities across the globe, from Singapore to Sweden, Brazil to Bahrain. Each culture brought its own unique perspective to the work, enriching our understanding and approach. One particularly meaningful project emerged through our collaboration with a group of Palestinian and Israeli peace activists who saw in our work a model for religious dialogue in conflict zones. They adapted our approach to create spaces where people from different faiths could share their spiritual experiences while acknowledging their community's painful histories. As I sit here now, a decade after that fateful night in Chicago, I can trace the intricate pattern of events that led from personal crisis to collective transformation. The prophet's appearance in that shadowy realm, which once filled me with such uncertainty and fear, now seems like a gift, a divine invitation to expand not just my own understanding, but to help create spaces where others could safely explore their deepest questions. Our center has become a beacon for seekers from all walks of life. Last week, I watched as a young Muslim woman engaged in deep discussion with a Catholic priest about the nature of divine love, while nearby, a Buddhist meditation teacher shared breathing techniques with a group of curious teenagers. The scene would have been unimaginable to my younger self, yet now it feels like the most natural thing in the world. Sarah and I recently welcomed our first grandchild, a beautiful girl named Noor, meaning light in Arabic. As I hold her, watching her discover the world with wide-eyed wonder, I think about the legacy we're creating. She will grow up in a world where questioning doesn't mean betrayal, where spiritual growth isn't confined by rigid boundaries, where different paths to truth are honored and celebrated. My father, now in his 80s but still sharp of mind and warm of heart, visits every Friday to spend time with his granddaughter. The other day, I found him showing her the prayer beads he's carried for decades, telling her stories about our family's spiritual heritage. But now these stories include tales of transformation and growth, of bridges built and understanding gained. The manuscript that began as a personal testimony has evolved into a living document, continually enriched by the stories of those who find their way to our community. The latest edition includes voices from around the world, each unique, yet each echoing the universal human quest for meaning and connection. Yesterday, during our evening gathering, a new visitor asked me if I ever regretted sharing my near-death experience, given the upheaval it caused in my life. Looking around the room at the diverse faces deep in conversation, at the bonds of understanding being forged, at the light of discovery in people's eyes, I could only smile. What I saw in that tunnel, I told her, wasn't just about me. It was about all of us, our questions, our doubts, our yearning for deeper truth. Sometimes the greatest gift we can receive is the courage to question, and the greatest gift we can give is creating space for others to do the same. As the call to prayer sounds from the nearby mosque, mixing with the evening bells of the church down the street, I feel a profound sense of peace. The journey that began with a vision of the prophet in shadows has led to something I never could have imagined, a community where light shines through many windows, creating not confusion, but a more complete understanding of the divine. My prayer beads, a gift from my father years ago, rest in my hands as I watch the sun set over our city. Each bead represents not just a prayer now, but a story of transformation, a bridge built, a heart opened. The shadows that once seemed so threatening have become merely the spaces between lights, necessary contrasts that help us appreciate the brightness all the more. And in the end, isn't that what faith is truly about? Not the absence of questions, but the courage to ask them. Not the certainty of having all the answers, but the wisdom to remain open to new understanding. Not the solitude of a single path, but the rich tapestry of many journeys interweaving, creating something more beautiful than any one thread could achieve alone. As night falls and the stars begin to appear, I think about that tunnel once more, but now with gratitude rather than fear. For in losing what I thought was unshakable faith, I found something far more precious, a truth big enough to embrace all truths, a light bright enough to illuminate all paths, and a love deep enough to bridge all differences. And in this understanding, I am finally truly home,